Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. I'm Fabiana Bacchini, Executive Director of the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation. CPBF is a charitable organization, and our mission is to support and educate families of premature babies. This Preemie Chats series is one of the many initiatives we have to bring information for families and healthcare professionals. Here every Friday, we talk with experts, researchers, and parents who share with us their experience and knowledge. Also on our website, canadianpreemies.org, parents will find all kinds of resources and support. And today we're going to talk about improving educational support for children born preterm. Children born preterm are at risk of cognitive and behavior problems, which can impact their performance at school. As a group, preterm born children are also at a higher risk for special education needs than kids born at term. In this session, Professor Johnson will briefly discuss the impact of preterm birth on children's educational outcomes, and will describe research aimed at raising awareness of prematurity in the education sector and improving school support for preterm born children and their families. Dr. Samantha Johnson is a developmental psychologist and professor of child development at the University of Leicester in the UK. She has a program of research focused on understanding and improving long-term outcomes for children born preterm. She has also contributed to the development of parent-completed outcome assessments and to clinical guidelines for follow-up care for babies admitted to neonatal care after birth. Samantha, thank you so much for joining us live from Leicester, England. It's such a pleasure to have you here. And I'm so looking forward to this conversation and learn so much from you.
Thank you. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to talk to you and the families you support. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
That's wonderful. So I'm going to share here your slides. Give me one moment. And then for everyone watching us live from home, on the hospital, we'll have a period for Q&A at the end of her presentation. So you can send your questions on the box below the screen. So the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. So as Fabiana has said, I'm a developmental psychologist by background. And for the last 20 years or so, I've been doing research looking into what happens to premature babies as they grow up. So looking at the long-term outcomes after preterm birth. And over this time, not just as a psychologist, but also as a parent, I've become much more interested in how we can understand how premature birth can impact on children's learning and performance at school. And very recently, how we can try and improve the support that these children receive at school if they might need it. So I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to tell you about some of the work that we've been doing about trying to improve support in this area. Okay, next slide. So to try and summarize, I guess, 30 years worth of research into 30 seconds, what we know about long-term outcomes after preterm birth, very briefly, we know that children who are born preterm are at higher risk for a whole range of developmental problems and disorders compared with children who are born at term. And we know that often, if children have developmental problems, these can emerge early in infancy as early developmental delays, and they might persist across childhood and adolescence and even into adulthood. We also know that premature birth can affect multiple areas of a child's development. So preterm children can often have difficulties in more than one developmental domain, such as motor difficulties, cognitive or social emotional problems, and that even if one of those on its own isn't significant, having subtle difficulties in a number of areas can actually combine to have quite an impact on your everyday learning or your everyday life. We also know, very importantly, a point I want to make both now and towards the end of this is that not every preterm child will go on to have difficulties later in life. So what I'm talking about now is the difficulties that children can have, and we're talking about as a group on average. But not every preterm child will go on to have developmental problems. But what we do know is that the earlier a baby is born, the greater the risk of difficulties later in life. So the more premature a baby is born, the greater the likelihood they may have developmental problems. And so that means that children who are born very preterm or extremely preterm are at greatest risk. And studies over many years that have focused on cognitive outcomes as being important for learning have really showed that children born preterm, on average, have lower IQ scores or intelligence test scores than children born at term. But actually, it's not very helpful to know that someone has low IQ or a child in your class has a low IQ. We want to know more specifically about what kinds of difficulties they might have so we know how to support them. And in that area, we have made great progress over recent years in understanding that there's this particular pattern of cognitive and social emotional problems which might impact learning. Next slide. So, and these are shown here in this picture here. There's, I guess, 6 areas of difficulties preterm children might have, which particularly impact on their performance at school. So I'll go through these just very briefly, each one of them, because parents frequently ask us, what kinds of difficulties might my child have and what do I need to look out for? So the first one, if we move on to the next slide, is slow processing speed. And we know that children born preterm more often have slower processing speed on average than children who are born at term. So this means simply they may take longer to perform mental tasks. So it means they might take longer to read or comprehend instructions or to complete a task they're working on. So quite often they might need additional time for activities to complete activities in the classroom. So moving on to the next one. We also know that children born preterm are more likely than their term-born peers to have difficulties with visuospatial processing or with fine motor skills or have poor hand-eye coordination. So these kinds of skills are what we use to locate or to identify the location of objects in the environment and use that information to coordinate it with our hand movements. So, and these kinds of skills are important for all sorts of activities in everyday life and in the classroom. And children with difficulties in these areas might struggle, for example, saying getting changed for PE, participating in sports or navigating their way around the classroom, down to things like having difficulties with handwriting, drawing, or using scissors or copying information from the whiteboard. So you can see that these kinds of difficulties might have quite a wide impact on performance at school. The next one is we also know that on average, children born preterm tend to be at higher risk for learning difficulties than children who are born at term. And we also know that of all the subjects studied at school, preterm children are most likely to have difficulties with mathematics. Moving on to attention, we also know that children born preterm are more likely to have difficulties with attention or concentration than children born at term. So they may have more difficulties paying attention to tasks. They may be more easily distracted or make careless mistakes with their schoolwork. And research also shows that children born preterm are at high risk of a diagnosis of ADHD, which is attention deficit or hyperactivity disorder. And where they do have these diagnoses, they tend to have more difficulties with a lack of attention rather than with hyperactive behaviours. But even so, even though there's an increased risk for ADHD, there's still only a small proportion of preterm children will have a diagnosis. But many more might have attention or concentration difficulties, which even though aren't that severe, still impact on their learning in the classroom. Moving on to social and emotional problems, there's a higher risk for social and emotional problems after preterm birth. And in particular, we know that preterm children, where they do have these difficulties, tend to be shy, anxious, or withdrawn, tend to be fearful or have worries, sort of phobias, and often have difficulty with social interactions or communications. So might have difficulty interacting with their peers and making and maintaining friendships. And again, there's a higher risk of autism after preterm birth, particularly after extremely preterm birth. But actually, as only a small proportion of preterm children will have a diagnosis of autism, but we know that many more may have some milder difficulties with social or communication issues, which still might impact upon their everyday life. And the final one I want to mention is working memory. So preterm children, we know on average, tend to have or be at more risk for working memory difficulties than children who are born at term. Now, working memory might be thought of as a mental notepad where you can store information for a short period of time while focusing on another task or something else. So we can think of it as an example in terms of if a teacher gives you a long list of instructions of things you need to do in the classroom, being able to remember those instructions while implementing each step is where your working memory would really come in. And children with difficulties in this area might struggle to follow instructions or have difficulty carrying out tasks that have multiple steps, or they might appear to have poor organisation or lose things easily. So altogether, these are the kind of areas in which we see that preterm children who have difficulties tend to have difficulties in these areas. But if we move on, one other important piece of information from the research is that we know that there's really no good evidence for an increased risk of conduct problems. So what this means is, compared with children born at term, preterm children tend not to have more difficulties with tend not to have more behaviour problems. So they tend not to be aggressive or delinquent or disruptive or antisocial. In fact, the opposite. They tend to be the shy, withdrawn children rather than the disruptive children in the classroom. Now, this is important because this kind of pattern of problems where children have poor attention and concentration, but they're actually quite shy and withdrawn and they tend not to ask for help, tend not to be hyperactive or disruptive, means that they tend not to disrupt the classroom in the way that other children with difficulties might do. And we know that preterm children's difficulties for that reason may be overlooked. And that's why it's really important for education professionals to know the kinds of difficulties that preterm children might have. So if we move on, I also want to just very briefly show you two graphs to show that there is real good evidence that actually these kinds of difficulties or that preterm birth itself is associated with poorer educational outcomes. And again, I'm going to say on average, this is not for every child, it's on average as a group. So we know that children born preterm tend to have more special educational needs than children who were born at term. And what this graph here shows is the percentage of children who had special educational needs in schools in Scotland in relation to their gestational age at birth. And what you can see here on the right-hand side is that for children born at term at 37, 38, 39 or 40 weeks of gestation, roughly about 5% of those children would have special educational needs. But for children born very preterm at 28 to 32 weeks, 13% of those children had special educational needs. So that's about 1 in 8 children compared to about 1 in 20 children born at term. And for those born extremely preterm, it's about 1 in 3 children. So you can clearly see here that point I made earlier, that the earlier or more preterm a child is born, the greater the risk of special educational needs or difficulties later in childhood. And of course, well, in the UK at least, I will say, only a small proportion of children will be classified as having special educational needs. And we here in the UK, lots of talk about parents who struggle to get their child to have a special educational needs support. But even if we don't just look at those children, if we look at all preterm children and move on to the next slide, we can see that even in terms of academic attainment, overall, preterm children have poorer academic attainment than children born at term. So these bars here show the proportion of children who have a good level of attainment at the end of the first year of primary school in the UK in all of the areas of learning that we assess. So we're already testing our children at age 5 in the UK. And the yellow bars are the orange bars are full-term children and blue bars are very preterm. And in every area of learning, fewer very preterm children have a good level of development already by age 5 in primary school compared with the full-term children. And it's in every area of the curriculum: personal, social, emotional development, communication and language, mathematics, science, PE and creative development. But the biggest differences tends to be in mathematics. So right from the outset of schooling, we can see that preterm birth can have an impact on a children's attainment at school. And if we move on to the next slide, this is why I personally and many of my colleagues think it's really important that teachers know this information. Teachers need to know that premature birth can affect children and their schooling, and they need to know what they can do about this to support the children in the classroom. And this is important because of the proportion of children that are born preterm, we know that about 2 or maybe 3 children in every average size class are likely to have been born preterm. So supporting preterm children is not just the job for the special needs coordinator or the educational psychologist. It's really of concern to all teachers. So if we move on, it's really important that teachers know about this, but what families have been telling us is that they don't think teachers know enough. And this is something that we hear quite a lot from families, is that they really struggle to get teachers to understand that their child's premature birth may still be affecting them later in childhood, and get them to accept that the child might need some additional support. And there's a charity in the UK called The Smallest Things, who recently did quite a large survey of parents of preterm children. And they found that more than 90% of parents felt there should be more awareness and understanding of the educational needs of preterm children in the education system. And less than half of the parents they surveyed felt that school staff really understood their children's learning needs. And only about 1/3 of parents felt that their child's needs educationally were actually being met in school. So teachers really need to know. Families are telling us that teachers don't know. And then if we move on, we've also heard from teachers that, onto the next slide, sorry, Fabiana. Teachers are also telling us that they need this information, that perhaps they don't have sufficient training in this area. So we surveyed teachers in the UK and all school staff and educational psychologists. And we found that actually teachers want this information. 75%, so 3/4 of the teachers we asked, they felt that if a parent told them their child was born preterm, it would be beneficial for the child. But the concerning thing was that even though they thought this information would be helpful, I'm not sure they have sufficient training to understand what to do with that information. Only 16% of teachers had received any training about preterm birth. And in fact, their poorest areas of knowledge were that preterm children were at higher risk for attention problems, social emotional difficulties, and mathematics difficulties. And as I've already told you, those are some of the most common difficulties that preterm children might face. So actually, our concern was that preterm children might not be getting the support in the areas they need it the most. And so what we've been doing recently, if we move on to try and address this, is to try and raise awareness of prematurity in the education system. Teachers also told us from our survey that the training they want would need to be online, preferably, so they can access it whenever is convenient. And so we developed 2 years ago the Preterm Birth e-learning resource as part of the PRISM study project, and it's freely available for parents and teachers and professionals to use online at pretermbirth.info. So absolutely anyone can use this evidence-based resource. Now, if we move on to the next slide, I guess we may have parents here today. I want to reassure parents, as a parent myself, that actually we didn't just develop this as professionals, this resource. We worked very closely with stakeholders. We got people together. We had parents of preterm born children. We had young adults who were born preterm themselves, some with disabilities, some who had no difficulties in school. We got together with education professionals and teachers, teaching assistants, school staff, and they all together worked with us, as you can see from these photographs, to develop the content of this e-learning resource. So they told us what they wanted teachers to know, and we incorporated all of that into the content of this resource. And if we move to the next slide, you'll see that the resource itself, which is online, is 5 separate sections, so you can dip in and out of it and just look at 1 or 2 if you want to. And it basically summarizes the latest research evidence on what preterm birth is, because teachers told us that they really wanted to know that basic information, how it affects children's educational outcomes, how it affects their cognitive and motor development and their social and emotional outcomes, and then finally moving on the most important section, I think, if we go to the next slide, is the final section, which provides practical strategies that teachers can use to support preterm children in school. We really felt that raising awareness of prematurity without giving teachers the knowledge and the skills of what they can do to support those children would really be would not be beneficial. So we focused on providing strategies so that teachers can support children with the 6 areas of difficulty they might have that I outlined earlier. So the strategies focus on supporting children who have poor processing speed, fine motor skills, difficulties with maths, attention problems, social emotional problems, or difficulties with working memory. And so they can use this information resource to pick the strategies they think will be helpful to apply to the individual children that they teach in the classroom. So if we move on, just briefly to say that we released the resource actually 2 years ago now, but it feels like a year ago because I think I've lost a year with the pandemic. But since that time, we've really seen it's been used by over about 16,000 people in over 50 countries. And it's now being used to train teachers in schools and school staff, and being used to train educational psychologists. And we know it's being used in initial teacher training programs in universities to train the new intake of teachers. And we've got evidence that it's really raising awareness of prematurity in the education sector. So we evaluated the resource, and we know that teachers who use it, it massively improves their knowledge of the kinds of difficulties preterm children might have. And that knowledge is sustained many months later. And we also know that it's starting now to change policy. So we know that some schools are now changing their admission procedures to always ask the parents of new pupils about their birth history and ask whether the child's been born preterm. They may use that information to develop support strategies. Some schools we know are looking at how they can incorporate their seating plans to provide the best area in the classroom for children to be seated if they're preterm, considering what difficulties they may have. But I think one of the most unintended consequences, which is wonderful, and which is I think why I'm here talking to you today, is that actually we found that about 1/4 of the people that use the resource are parents of preterm children. So it's designed for teacher training, but actually parents are using it as a vital source of information about how prematurity may affect their child's learning. And it's also, parents are using it to go to the school to open up that conversation about premature birth, to say, my child was born preterm. It might make a difference. Please look at this evidence. Look at pretermbirth.info. So it's really empowering parents to advocate for their child. And if we move on to the next slide, I've just got 2 quotes that we have from parents about how they feel about this resource. In case you wanted to have a look at it, this might validate it a little. So we've had one parent who I think really describes well what I was trying to describe earlier about this pattern of difficulties. She said, my son was very preterm, but because he has no behavioural issues, we've had real difficulties getting his differences acknowledged and understood by his teachers. This site is really excellent in getting the issues across to busy teachers who can't be experts in everything, but do need to know how to help these precious children. So this is this issue of children potentially being overlooked because they aren't disruptive in the classroom. And then as a mother of a 23-week preterm child, she felt a huge sense of relief that there's finally a resource that will help educators understand the social, emotional, academic needs of my school-age child. The resource is long overdue and rightly focuses on the lifelong needs of those who experience daily the challenges that preterm birth may bring. So I hope that you will, if you might find this helpful, have a look at the resource, take it to your child's school, tell them that preterm birth may affect your child's learning, it may not, and give them the skills that they might need to support children with their learning. And then you can see the link there on the screen. I think I've got just one more slide with a couple of take-home messages, which I thought would be helpful. So we know from research that on average, preterm children may have more cognitive or social emotional difficulties than children born at term, and that might impact on their learning and attainment at school. And up to now, we know that teachers, not all teachers, but on average, have lacked awareness of the long-term consequences of preterm birth and how to support these children. We do know that our e-learning resource that's freely available does improve teachers' knowledge dramatically about preterm birth. And if they are able to use the strategies provided, it may improve educational support for preterm children and their families. That's our next step to find out in the research programme. But just want to finish with that important point that, as all parents and all professionals know, every child is different, born preterm or not. And in fact, I've talked a lot about the difficulties children might have, but I want to reiterate that not all preterm children will have difficulties later in life. Prematurity is a risk factor for later difficulties. It's not a diagnosis. So some children born at 23 weeks of gestation will have no difficulties at all, and some born just a few weeks early might benefit from a little additional support in school. And I think that's all I was planning to say. Very happy to take. Oh, and these are my colleagues who've developed the resource with me. Of course, it's not a work I've done on my own, and it's taken many years. So just to acknowledge the support from all of my colleagues here as well.
Okay. Thank you, Samantha, so much for this presentation, and thank you so much for this incredible work. As a parent of a preterm baby, I need to thank you for creating this tool for schools and for us families, because we also a lot of times don't know how to support the kids going to school and talk to school. We have a few comments on the chat, but I want to start opening with this question that if the child doesn't have a significant morbidity from the ICU or doesn't have a diagnosis of any sort, but you go to school and start finding some difficulties, but you don't really share with the school that your child was born preterm. And I think that is a step one, because once you reach the school age and there was not a lot of issues before, you kind of, okay, let's move on with this. That's how I feel a lot of families deal with that, especially babies who were born a little later than 30 weeks. So how can we first empower the families to share that information with the school?
Yeah, I think that's quite common, is that often, because these cognitive skills I've been talking about develop over time with age as well. And so quite often we see that children who don't have severe disabilities and are discharged from follow-up quite early on because there's no significant difficulties, then go to school. And when they're in the classroom and there's lots of demands on your cognitive skills and lots of demands on your attention and your working memory all of a sudden, that these difficulties might begin to emerge or might become apparent. And I guess really it's up to parents whether they want to share with the school or not the child was born preterm. And we know from our research that the parents are split, as you probably know. Some want to share all the information and some would prefer to just let this go now. But I would say if you tell the teacher that the child was born preterm, it's only worthwhile, I think, if the teacher has an understanding of what that means and they know how to support the child. And that's why we were very, very careful in the e-learning resource to provide information about strategies. And certainly teachers are telling us that they think it would be beneficial. I think ultimately what they need to do is a careful individual assessment of each child. But knowing that a child is born preterm and knowing where to look for the difficulties and what they might be might help guide them as to the best strategies to put in place. But again, every child is different, and every child will need sort of a careful assessment about what their individual needs are. But yeah, it's up to parents.
Absolutely. So let me just say hi. We have Lonnie. Thank you for your work and for sharing. And we also have here Sonia joining us from Turks and Caicos. Amazing presentation. And let me go back on the chat here. We have a lot of here from Juliet. She's joining us from the Netherlands. Juliet is our regular in our audience. She's amazing. She was born preterm with 28 weeks. From the article, it comes from the other side. So I just want to say hi to you. But she also has a question that I don't know if it fits here on the chat. Let's see. Great example that teachers know this without being labeled. A big label on your head prevents you to feel different. I wish my teachers took it serious, since I did struggle a bit with writing as a 6-year-old. The teacher was quite mean to me for not writing with a neat handwriting while I was doing my very best. And I struggle with sports due to living with bronchopulmonary dysplasia. Wish my sports teacher understood this. It would have helped me in my surrounding environment. Let me keep reading here because it cut off. So helping my surrounding environment, why it was difficult to perform in certain sports like intermittent action sports, and I'm doing very well. Became a multi-endurance sporter, cycling, swimming, running, and that is still possible with lots of puzzling, and even if you have a BPD like me. And even my handwriting and math improved significantly. Wow, Juliette, thank you so much for sharing your story. And I do follow her on Facebook, and I see her doing all her sports, and it's very inspiring for all of us parents to see what is possible.
Yeah. And I think that's really important comment, because the strategies that are provided for teachers are actually strategies that would help in our resource would help any child, preterm or not, with working memory difficulties or with visuospatial difficulties, because it's about changing the environment in which children learn. We know that some things, like there's been quite a lot of focus in research on, say, working memory training, which tries to train children's working memory to improve it, but that doesn't seem to work at present. So there's other things being tried, but what this does is try to give teachers strategies to change the environment, to take the kind of, to enable children to better learn when they have those difficulties, to take account of their difficulties. So that does fit with what Juliette has said. And I've given so many presentations about mathematics skills and saying that on average, preterm children are quite poor at maths. And then there's always someone who tells me they've got a degree in mathematics and brilliant. So well done. There's always the exceptions.
It's true, because my son, he's 9 years old now, going to grade 4, and he has cerebral palsy, so he doesn't write. So everything he does is verbal, but he does all he counts on his head, and he knows all the subtraction and addition, and he knows the time, or it's 10 minutes to 1 o'clock, because he looks at the analog clock and he knows. So like, okay, that is pretty good.
Yeah.
Well, we have one more question here from Dana. Dana, thanks so much for joining us. For the graph on the academic achievement slide, what is the metric used to measure good achievement? How are these values generated?
So this is something that's very specific to the UK, to the English educational system. There's levels of learning in each area. And it's a child there's criteria in each area for whether you have a good level of learning or a good level of achievement or not. So it's a sort of a binary cutoff. There are other studies that have been done using standardized tests. So things which have metrics like IQ tests, and those show very, very similar outcomes. But that's quite UK specific. But there are studies that have used it's quite, in studies in other countries that have outcomes relevant to their education system. So there's recent data from the Netherlands, for example, using the Dutch pupil monitoring system. So even though the metrics are different between different countries, what we see is the same pattern of results, that on average, preterm children do poorer across all subjects, and that the more preterm you're born, the greater the difficulties are. So that the pattern is the same, irrespective of kind of how it's measured. That makes sense.
Okay, so let me add one more here from Ashley. I was born at 24 weeks in 1983. I was lucky to be in a follow-up program for several years alongside the study of teens that were preemies. The education system wasn't set up to meet my needs 100%, but did their best. Unfortunately, not much to help me. I have short-term memory issues and some processing issues that they didn't know how to really address. Thank you for sharing your story, Ashley.
Yeah, and Ashley, that's exactly the kind of story that we're hoping we might be able to change with this e-learning resource, because it can be accessed so freely. We want lots of teachers to use it, and it's really about making them aware of the kinds of difficulties you're describing and other adults and children have, and telling them what they can do about that. And I think that that's really about raising awareness and trying to give them the skills to change that. So hopefully we might start improving things in that respect.
Absolutely. So she add one more comment here. I have math difficulties, but I'm great with reading, writing, and spelling. I just like using IQ tests to show intelligence. They are inaccurate. Yes, let's talk a little bit about the IQ test because it's standardized. So how do we really, and sometimes it does discourage the parent. So how do we go by that?
Yeah, I think IQ tests are used a lot in research, aren't they? And they have been used an awful lot as a measure of general cognitive ability. And IQ tests compare your score with that of people of the same age in the general population. But I think we're moving on now in the research. And this is where it's going, is rather than using IQ tests, we're trying to pick out what are the specific specific skills that are really the problem. Because as I said, having an IQ number doesn't really tell a teacher where you need support. If we can say that actually these specific cognitive difficulties are the area of difficulty, like working memory, visuospatial processing, processing speed, executive functions, we know so much better now about those kinds of areas. So we can move away from IQ and more towards saying these are the specific areas and this is what you can do about it. It's much more informative for educational planning and intervention, I think.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the Smaller Things charity, because you mentioned them, and I know they have now this Prem-aware schools in UK that I find it absolutely amazing. I'm hoping every school in the world will eventually be a Prem-aware school. I'm going to share their website here. Somebody's interested, but tell us a little bit about what it is and how does it work.
So The Smallest Things, as I mentioned, is a charity in the UK that supports families with preterm babies after they've left the neonatal unit. So they're very much focused on what happens longer term. And they've got a real focus on improving things in schools. Because, as I said, I showed you that survey they did, which said that parents really struggling with schools. So what they did, and I think it's a wonderful initiative, last year in October 2020, they released this new Prem-aware award for schools, and they're inviting all schools to be Prem-aware, and they basically get I don't know if they get a certificate, but they get to use the logo on their website and on all their materials. And they basically believe that every child should have the opportunity to achieve the best possible outcomes from the start of schooling. And to achieve a Prem-aware award, it's really very simple. There's just 3 simple steps. They ask that, and they're focused on, training, awareness, and feedback. So they ask that school staff complete the pretermbirth.info training. So that's one thing they need to do. And they even ask if just senior staff complete the training and cascade it to the rest of the staff. The second thing is about awareness. They want the schools to ask parents and carers if their child was born preterm on school entry. So they are ask it. Parents don't have to give the information, obviously, but they want to encourage parents to reveal their child's birth history. And thirdly, they want the schools to request feedback from parents and carers about any extra support they provide, so that the schools are involving parents and carers more in any additional support. So the school just has to do those 3 things and they will receive a Prem-aware award. But I think it's a really nice way to approach it. And this charity have been very careful about, not giving the impression that all preterm children will need help, but it's about thinking about prematurity in those that do. And I know they've got 6 or 7 schools already that have come on board and got the Prem-aware award, and there's quite a few more in the pipeline. So I think it's a really nice initiative to raise awareness of prematurity in a really sensible way in the education sector. Would be great if it went beyond the UK. So let's see.
Wow, you're setting the challenge for Canada. So
I am, yes.
So let's see. So I want to wrap it up with Juliette's comment, and obviously your comment at the end. I think it really show how successful preemies can be despite the very hard start in life. And Juliette, I think, is such an example of that. She said it is indeed a risk factor. It doesn't mean that being born preterm means you cannot become successful in life and will become an unhappy person. I think that will support parents to see preterm born adults knowing that from a tiny baby, you can grow up in an amazing adult person living a happy and blessed life. Oh my God, Juliette, you're going to put tears in my eyes. Thank you so much for this comment, and it is so true. And you know, there is the box that we sometimes limit our kids and put them in a box and cannot see beyond the box. And I think, you know, just, yes, we acknowledge the difficulties, the hard times that they can have, but that they might not limit them in life to whatever they want to do. And I think that is a beautiful message. And Juliette is a living person on that. And she's 40 years old. So she was a preterm baby many years ago when we didn't have as much knowledge that we have today. But Samantha, I want you to give one last message for parents or teachers listening to us today, so we can wrap up our session and be ready for the next school year that starts here in Canada next week.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was going to say similar to Juliette in that, you know, we've got to remember that preterm birth is a risk factor for problems later in life, and not every child will have difficulties, but if they do, it would be helpful to have support. But I guess I just think, say, you know, there's much to be hopeful about and positive about as parents. You know, neonatal care is improving all the time, survival's improving, and hopefully that will translate to better developmental outcomes. But, you know, we spend so much resource on neonatal care, and these babies are there for 12 weeks, maybe 12 months. But they're 12 years in education. So if we can get this right and we can help teachers and give them the knowledge, the medical knowledge that we have to help them better support preterm children, we've got a real window of opportunity to change things, not just at school, their experience at school, but hopefully will impact on their future kind of well-being and quality of life. And I think the tide is turning and it's kind of exciting times. So much to be hopeful.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge here today, your expertise, your research. I'm very grateful that I had this opportunity to talk to you and bring your information to our audience here in Canada. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And for all of you watching us, thank you so much for joining us here today. The video of today's session and all the videos from our live series are available on the CPBF website, which is right here, the CanadianPreemies.org. And I want to thank our sponsor, AstraZeneca and Water Wives, for their ongoing support to our education sessions. And we are a charitable organization, and we believe that through education and support, we can empower families, ensuring they are ready to care for their premature babies. Visit our website, consider making a donation. Together, we can create a brighter future for all our families. And I will see you again next Friday, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you and stay well.